one of the crazier stories that came out, and I think this was in Variety, is that Biden grew more concerned about AI after screening the most recent Mission Impossible movie, in which the villain is a sentient AI that seizes control of the world's intelligence apparatus.
Is that true? That's not true.
Well, that's what the story said.
Didn't the press reporter ask the press secretary this, and this was the response? Who said this?
The White House chief of staff, I guess.
Said Reed, yeah, wow, unbelievable.
The crazy thing is that I think the reason they're putting out this story is they don't want to admit how the EO really happened, which is a bunch of lobbyists came in. And like you said, a lot of powerful people from big tech, they're all clamoring for regulatory capture. They're all clamoring to define the regulations so that they can benefit themselves and keep out new entrants. Because one of the big targets here is going to be open source software. So if you are, for example, OpenAI, which is no longer open, it's closed source, the number one thing you want to do is pull up the ladder before open source software can get a lot of momentum. And a big part of the regulation here does apply to open source software. I think one of the most problematic things about this, just to move on to the next point, is the way that it's not just this 110-page EO that's being promulgated. The directive is for all these other parts of the federal government to start creating their own regulations. So it says here that the National Institute of Standards and Technology will develop standards for red team testing of these models. It directs the Department of Commerce to develop standards for, like you said, Freeberg, labeling AI-generated content.
It directs explicitly the FTC to use existing regulation to go and legislate. It requires the FCC to think about spectrum licensing rules through this lens. You're absolutely right. It activates every agency of the government to create more bureaucracy.
More importantly, it creates authority for agencies of the government to go into private servers and run audits. You're allowing the government for the first time ever to have access to private information, private computing infrastructure, rather than do what the job of the government should be, which is to regulate the outputs, to regulate the outcomes, to regulate illegal and illicit activities, rather than regulate systems and methods that, as Sachs point out, are pre-convicted of a crime. There is no crime until a crime is committed. And so this idea that the government can come in and regulate and keep a crime from being committed by auditing and managing all the systems and methods that software companies are using puts the United States at an extraordinary and unfair disadvantage on a global stage, by the way. And by the way, Llama 2 is out there. Hardware is out there. All the tooling is out there for others to start to get well ahead.
Good news about the immigration thing. They actually, on the other side, do streamline the immigration process for people with AI or other critical technologies. So on the one hand, we should be able to hire them, but then on the back end, we'll have to file a TPS report about what they do.
Let me just finish my point about all these different agencies being directed now to promulgate regulations. And by the way, there's some new committee or council that's being created of 29 different parts of the federal government that are now going to coordinate on this AI stuff. So it's going to be a Brussels-style bureaucracy. What's going to happen is that with all of these different bodies issuing new regulations, it's going to get more and more burdensome on technology companies until the point where they cry out for some sort of rationalization of this regime. They're going to say, listen, we can't keep up with FCC and Department of Commerce and this NIT Standards Board. Just give us one agency to deal with. And so the industry itself is eventually going to cry uncle and say, like, please, just give us one. And you already hear people like Sam Altman and so forth calling for the equivalent of Atomic Energy Commission for AI. This is how we're going to end up with a federal software commission, just like we have a FCC to run big communications and we have a FDA to run big pharma. We're going to end up with a federal software commission to run software, big software. And the thing to realize about AI is that functionally, there's no way to really say what the difference is between AI and software in general. Every single technology company in Silicon Valley has AI on its roadmap. It's a new computing paradigm. Everybody is incorporating it. Everyone is using some elements of AI. So this wave of AI is just becoming software. So we're going to take the one part of our economy that has been free market and relatively unregulated, which is software. It's like the last bastion of true entrepreneurial capitalism. And we're going to create a new federal agency to manage it. That's where we're all headed here. And we're going to end up as an industry in the same place that pharma has ended up or telecom has ended up, which is you go for permission to Washington.
No, Nick, can you just put this up? So I did, write a blog post sort of asking for this AI regulation. And I do think like the model of the FDA is probably the best one where in certain use cases, I do think that you can create a sandbox where these things can be tested and I think can be evaluated. The problem is that this legislation or this executive order doesn't really do that. So the way that I wrote this was, well, what are the arguments against what I'm proposing? And unfortunately, I have to say every single one of those arguments is not valid. So I think that we should have gone in the direction of like a simplifying assumption, which is that most of this stuff is just software. And there are going to be some very specific kinds of businesses that before you take it to market, you should do something that's equivalent to sticking it in a sandbox, letting people see it. And I think it's easy to define what those are, actually. And the fact that we didn't do that and we have this overly generalized approach is going to create more chaos, and people will not know whether they're in violation or they're in support. They're going to be sort of pre-guilty, as you said, Sachs, of a pre-crime. And it's just going to be chaos. So I think
this is a smorgasbord for politicians because everyone's going to be lobbying them to try and shape the regulations the way they want.
I think it's going to be a smorgasbord for lawyers.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's going to hire lawyers and lobbyists and policy people to try and shape these regulations.
Good time to bet on India. Thank God for Mark Zuckerberg and the open sourcing of the Llama 2 model.
It's not entirely open source, right? I mean, I think the biggest thing with Llama 2 that I find problematic is that it has these arbitrary thresholds on the number of users one can have.
Yes.
Before you have to go back to Facebook.
It's 700 million, I think, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Before I give all the credit to Facebook, I'd rather say that I think there are a lot of open source alternatives, including Mistral, that I think are much better.
Yeah.
And free and open and in the clear, where you can have unencumbered growth, not dependent on anybody else.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think, Friedberg, your larger point about US versus India versus China, I think this could have a major impact on our global competitiveness.
Of course.
Because as you look around what's happening in the American system, there are so many things going wrong, right? Our fiscal situation is untenable. We're mired in massive debt. We have tremendous internal division in the country. Many of our cities are rife with crime. You just look at the number of people living on the streets. It's not good. I mean, there's a lot of indicators that America is in decline. We're involved in way too many foreign wars. So there's a lot of bad things happening. However, the one bright spot that America has had going for it now, I think for decades, is that we've always been the leader in new technology development. I mean, we're the ones who pioneered the internet. We're the place where mobile took off. We're the place where the cloud took off. And everyone else has been playing catch up with that. And I think we are in the lead in terms of AI development. I mean, other countries are doing it too, but I think that we are in the lead. And it's not because of the involvement of government. It's because we have this vibrant private sector that's willing to invest risk capital where that 9 out of 10 checks that you write are going to zero. But that one check, that 1 out of 10, hopefully could be a huge outcome. So we've had this incredible ecosystem of software development that is free and unregulated, that is clustered around Silicon Valley, but it radiates out to many other places. And the only reason that ecosystem has thrived and survived is the reason that Bill Gurley stated at All In Summit, which is, 2,200 miles away from Washington. And Washington has generally kept its mitts off. And now we are headed to a place where not just AI, but basically all software companies are headed for regulation. And like I said, right now it's 29 different agencies promulgating the regulations. But where this is going to end up is that the industry is eventually going to beg for its own agency just to rationalize all the spaghetti of different regulations. We are eventually going to beg for our federal agency overlord just to rationalize this whole mess. And sadly, I think that's where we're going to end up. And a lot of what is special about our industry, which is that two guys in a garage really can get started in a completely permissionless way, I think that's going to be jeopardized.
If that's the end game, that's genius.
I think that is the end game.